Hi, and welcome to another episode of Talking About Teaching Economics. My guest today is Trevor Tombe, and we'll be talking about that basket of stuff that goes with the discussion of unemployment in your standard intro course. So I guess we'll start it off, Trevor, with where in the course do you tackle this big basket of stuff?
Well, that's a great question. First, it's great to be on with you today. So thanks for having me on. So I usually tackle these issues around labor market measures very early in class, if only just to get the vocabulary right, lay the foundation around, what the words mean, what they measure, what does some of the data patterns look, so that everyone's well prepared when we get to a little bit deeper dive into each of those topics later on. So these measurement issues, all the different labor market statistics, and some standard measures of economic activity generally, like GDP and output and so on, very early on, at least when I approach a principles class.
So it comes with that same discussion of GDP, and am I correct in sensing that you use sort of a data-driven approach when you first start introducing the topic?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I guess that's my personal style, very visual, at least myself as a learner. And I think it lends itself pretty effectively to a large class as well. So the slides I use as aids almost never have words on them. It's usually a lot of data to illustrate a point. And if there are words, just a few of them. You do have to be careful in those large lecture rooms when there's a couple hundred people and those in the back, making sure they can see everything. So yeah, very data driven. And I think today especially, and even prior to COVID, I mean, Canada's economy has seen a lot of very interesting developments over the past several years, both positive and negative. COVID and the disruptions that it had for the labor market has also meant that many of these measures, in terms of even how we define them, didn't quite work as well to summarize the actual experience that we all went through. And the data is just really incredibly stark when you plot it over time and how big those changes were. And then even now, the recovery getting to levels in terms of participation in the labor force, at higher levels than we've seen ever. So I think really showing that data to students really reminds them that these are, well, sometimes it might seem like an abstract concept to memorize and regurgitate on an exam. It's actually a very important, practical set of information and knowledge that they need as just individuals in life going forward, whether or not they continue to major in economics or not.
No, that's great. Thing in talking about all the different measures and some of the other the non-standard, the non-headline approach, and the definitions. What do you focus on any specific type of unemployment, maybe more than others? Are there some you kind of go, yeah, that's not all that exciting or interesting for where we are or what's going on? Because again, you've got all those, your standard types of your four types of unemployment, and all your additional measures, including underemployment, etc. So what of that do you focus on?
But usually I start just with the broader idea of what it is that we're actually trying to capture with these measures. And that's about the amount of kind of maybe unused labor, if you will, that's out there. What fraction of individuals, or what fraction of individuals' time do they want to allocate to employment activities that they're really maybe not able to? So how much slack is there, if you will, in the labor market? And that standard measure of unemployment is a natural place to start, because you think, well, newborn babies aren't employed, right? Is that a public policy problem? Well, no, they're not actually in the labor force. They don't want to be, to the extent that they have wants at all beyond the immediate needs. We shouldn't be counting them, the fact that they're not in the labor force. Same with a retired individual. They've actively made a choice to shift their time to other activities, and so not in the labor force. And so think about, okay, well, who is? We'll count those who are employed and those who, in response to a survey question, say that they want to be employed. And not only that, but actually demonstrating they want to be employed by searching, actively looking. That's our labor force. And so what fraction of it actually has a job? That's our standard measure of unemployment, and a very simple one. Very powerful because it's also very common. It's how a lot of countries will measure it in very similar ways. They might differ at the edge in terms of whether they count 15-year-olds or not, right? That's an important Canada-US distinction. But it's pretty standard, and it's pretty standard over time. So you can get very long series to try and compare situations and recessions today versus many, many decades ago. Oh, and I guess, yeah, where do we go from there? So you mentioned many other unemployment measures. So the first thing that I do, and maybe I do this a lot, is compare ourselves to the United States. I should say as an aside that I also taught out of the new Wolfers and Stevenson Act, which just had a US edition at the time. So they've since come out with one. And so that was a limitation there, or you're sort of forced to show a contrasting view because the physical book itself would have the US data and you'd want to show the Canadian stuff in class. But because we define things differently, you also get sometimes very different unemployment rates. And so that's both just a fun fact to know how we do things differently, and that there's no one magic way to do it. There's no objectively correct or incorrect way to do it. There's lots of these trade-offs that statisticians will make when they design these surveys. But it also shows that the US has a lower unemployment rate. Does that mean their labor market is performing at, better than the Canadian labor market that might have a higher unemployment rate? Often, no, not necessarily, because we count 15-year-olds, which are just going to naturally have a lower attachment to the labor market than others. And so the fact that the US just counts 16 and up has a meaningful effect on that aggregate unemployment. So it's that lesson that I think not just individuals in any econ or macro class, but just in general, every class you take, be very careful with data, right? You want to know exactly what's going into those numbers and make sure you understand how they're constructed, how to interpret them, how to compare them appropriately over time and with others. So I think right there with unemployment presents very starkly an important lesson about just working with data in general.
No, a general caution about data and measurement is always a good idea, because we are guessing, to be fair. So do you, when you're talking,
I guess maybe on that point, this is also something where, getting into it, how do we even know how many people are employed? That's something where I think it's lost in a lot of our public conversations around labor market statistics as well. If we have a labor force survey result come in on a particular Friday, and I should say that's quite convenient for class because you'll have multiple updates to the labor force survey throughout the semester. So interesting developments you can always loop into lecture. But if things move by 1/10 of a point here or 1/10 of a point there, there'll be headlines that say, 10,000 lost jobs or something to that effect. And that's just well within the natural margin of error, which is quite a bit wider than I think a lot of people appreciate. So we're literally just surveying Canadians. We're taking a poll, a labor market poll, if you will, and it's going to have that plus or minus whatever, 19 times out of 20, like even a political poll. So making sure to kind of reinforce that there is sometimes quite a bit of natural volatility in these measures, just because it's a relatively small sample of the overall labor force.
I always make the point that, what incentive does anybody have to report honestly in this thing?
Civic duty.
Civic duty. Oh, you can get a little ways on that, let's be honest, but it's I wouldn't want to bet the farm on it.
Well, there's the response rates, to Stackhand's credit, they did fall through high. COVID, pretty materially, but they're high, right? I think political pollsters would love to have the response rate that StatsCan does. So I think that civic obligation of like, okay, it's our National Statistical Agency surveying us. That's an interesting point, though. I think unlike the census, the legal repercussions of not engaging with the labor force survey are maybe a little different.
Yeah. So you talked about this in sort of setting it up and this the concept as a measure of slack or sort of efficiency. I'm trying not to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to remember exactly what you said. But do you link this at all to the PPF?
Oh, later on for sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I guess maybe I'll say one thing before getting to the PPF is
sure
that COVID gave a really I want to say interesting, but it's also quite a traumatic experience
Mm,
where the unemployment rate, yeah, rose, but not as high as the true underlying slack in the labor market was.
right.
So much so that StatCan came out with a new measure monthly. They've since discontinued it. But what happened in those early months of the pandemic, where many people were effectively unemployed, working 0 hours,
Mm,
uh, but not laid off, right? Still
yeah.
formally connected to an employer, even if for very long stretches of time,
Mm,
no work was actually undertaken. And there at peak, you had about 1/3 of the entire labor force, just
wow.
in terms of hours, that was not working,
That was
unemployed.
idle. Yeah.
Yeah. And so StatCan called that the labor underutilization rate.
Okay.
That's a mouthful, but it's that language that links in to at least how I talk about the production
Mhm.
possibility frontier. Right, we produce
No.
output using inputs, and we have a lot of inputs that are available. Labor's one; it's an important one. Buildings, machinery, land, and so on are others, and machines that sit idle, or buildings unused, or land unused. This represents potentially underutilizing
Mhm.
those important inputs. So if you have resources available that you're not using, then you're not producing as much as you could if you were to use
Right.
them. So that labor underutilization rate is very similar to capital underutilization rates. And that's something where capital utilization rates are also something that we have a really good measure of
Mhm.
from StatCan. And so thinking about whether those utilization rates rise or fall is critical to think about whether or not you're uh, inside the PPF or not.
Mm.
I also tend to think about teaching the PPF maybe a little bit differently
Oh.
than others, in that I do talk about points outside the PPF as being feasible in the short run.
Mm.
So, in a long run sense, it's not feasible to produce
Right.
beyond it, but you can utilize your machinery, equipment, and indeed even your
Mm.
labor at a rate that's beyond a sustainable level.
Mm.
You probably do need to have machinery idle for some time, if only for maintenance, or maybe it wears out at a accelerating rate if you're running at 24/7. Same with workers, right?
Yep.
The exhaustion compounds over time, and in a way that might be um, detrimental to long-term
Mhm.
productivity, let's say. So moving outside the PPF would be having a utilization rate that's above a long-run sustainable
Mm.
level. And so we can think about points both below and above the PPF by talking about utilization rates in that way.
So, do you get into the PPF initially before you have this discussion about unemployment, or after, or and you loop back to it?
So I generally do them kind of all at the same
Oh.
time, not literally all at exactly the
Yeah.
same time. So the ordering can vary, but it'll be in the same
Mm.
set of the first 2 or 3 lectures, where it's
Oh,
really
wow.
setting the
Okay.
stage about what it is that we're going to be investigating. And when we
Okay.
talk about output, I think the PPFs, I find it a pretty intuitive tool
Hmm.
to think about. Okay, there's an amount of output out there. We're not going to yet get into how you choose what you're producing, one good or another,
Mm.
but you can have a sense of there being some sustainable long run amount, and then we'll return to it later on when we think about trade offs. And I do teach even in a macro class things like comparative advantage
Hmm.
and those kind of topics that are, I guess, often and normally covered in a micro context. But yeah, because they link in together in such a natural way.
Hmm.
Unemployment just being about labor utilization, talking about capital as well. Very intuitive to connect that with
Yeah.
production possibility frontier.
So, this is a because I've taught in a number of different places across the country, including the Maritimes, which makes the discussion of structural unemployment really fun. Whereas you're in Calgary and Alberta, is structural something you focus a lot of time and energy on, or is it something that just kind of gets mentioned and we move on to the next thing?
No, it's absolutely something that gets a lot of attention, and an increasing amount of attention
Mm.
in the Alberta context, at least how I approach it. It's something that exists in every economy.
Of
There's
course.
always a skill mismatch to some extent or another, because there's always innovation, and this innovation is in generally not in every sector and not uniform across skill sets, and it takes time to adjust to these shocks. International trade as well, right? And so there's going to be some of that. In Alberta, interestingly, after oil prices dropped considerably between 2014 and 2016, creating a very large recession in the province here, the recovery from it was very different depending on the type of worker you look at. And there were many younger men in particular who were primarily associated with the, I guess, support activity roles, the associated construction activity, and some fabricated metal manufacturing. So these three areas where tens of thousands of those younger workers displaced from those sectors during the recession that really never recovered, right? Even today, the employment rate among that group is about 10 percentage points below where it was in 2014 before the recession started. And so this may very well reflect this kind of structural unemployment for individuals who, at least anecdotally, could access very high paying job opportunities in oil and gas during those boom years prior to 2014 that had trouble adjusting.
Yeah.
Like going into that recession, Alberta did have the lowest high school graduation rate, as an example, in the country. But it had a lot of opportunity for those individuals. But it's more difficult to respond to that negative shock and adjust into other sectors. And so training takes time. It's difficult. And while the data is imperfect, it looks like only about half of those displaced individuals did shift into education training opportunities, and the other half withdrew from the labor force. Really
just withdrew completely.
Just a permanent drop in labor force participation without a clear increase in education and training. I should say, as a caveat, it's tricky when you, getting back to the LFS being a poll, when you drill down into very narrow cells, it can be really hard to measure. So take a lot of that last couple of comments there with a grain of salt, but that's my best read on the data.
It's rational. It's inherently reasonable. I think you're seeing it reflected in other metrics and addiction and things like that.
Yeah. And that difference in terms of education and unemployment rates is also something that's quite important. And I think that's something where macro, I'm going to make a normative statement, needs to pay a little bit more attention to how heterogeneous experiences are across individuals, across sectors, across regions. Like often macro is taught, and I think less so now, but historically macro is taught at just this aggregate blob, and we don't pay so much attention to individuals. But individuals have different experiences of the macro economy, and indeed those differences themselves shape macroeconomic developments. So increasingly thinking about labor market outcomes across educational groups, across demographic groups, or even now, Statistics Canada has started reporting very detailed labor market information based on ethnicity or Indigenous status, for example, in a way that it never did prior to COVID. So building in those differences is something I'm increasingly doing as well.
So picking up on this, do you make the explicit link between employment and poverty? I mean, that, there's that often cited Brookings Institute study, how not to be poor. Is this a link you make explicitly, or is it something you just leave as implied?
So that's a great question. It's not something that I guess I link into explicitly in this course. I mean, poverty is something where I also teach a public finance course where we go through and spend a lot of time on this because it's a very important policy area with lots of different policy tools available to governments. And we do think a little bit more detail about the nature, sources, and different types of experiences people have in terms of low income spells. But yeah, not in a macro context, but it's a great question. Now it's going to make me think.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully I can do that once in a while. So I've noticed over the years that an increasing proportion of students have trouble talking about the labor force and employment and unemployment because they have no experience with the labor force at all. They've never participated. Is that something you've encountered? And if so, how do you get over that hurdle?
So I guess that's not something that I've
Okay.
encountered, or maybe it's something that exists that I haven't picked
Mm.
up on. So again, something that maybe I'll pay more attention to going forward. Now that you mentioned it, as if I always thought it was kind of a natural concept. You can all we can
Hmm.
picture, even if one hasn't had a job before, you know what they are, and you interact with people who have jobs all the time, including the professor at the front of the room.
Right.
But talking about the way in which an individual, especially a younger individual, experiences and accesses
Hmm.
the labor market in terms of job search. So we do spend time talking about that,
Yeah.
and Stacken has great data on how to engage in job searches, web
Mm.
searches versus help wanted ads, and those are on the rapid decline, and web searches and tools like Indeed and so on are rapidly increasing. And so we do talk about that, and that's maybe
Mhm.
something that they have engaged in. Like, how do you search for a job?
Right.
How does the changing nature of the way in which we search for a job affect the unemployment rate?
Mhm.
Like, if we have more efficient matching process connecting employers and employees, then we'd expect unemployment to be lower. And we can talk then about frictional unemployment
Right.
at the same time as structural. And maybe that's something a little bit more concrete. You can kind of picture searching the web for job
Mhm.
opportunities and replying to them uh, on on there. So I think, yeah, I guess I haven't noticed whether that
Okay.
presents a barrier to delivering that insight to someone who hasn't
Yeah.
actually tried to do it themselves before.
That's a good thing. Not to have to, because it's just something I've noticed in the last few years. There are students who just have no intuitive understanding of even job search because it's just not something they've ever contemplated doing. As being somewhat of a certain age, it's like, what do you mean you don't have a driver's license? I just that does not compute. Um,
Well, here in Alberta, you can get them when you're 14, so it computes even less.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you've kind of talked around it, but I think it might be useful to get it out there explicitly. What in this section on labor force and that kind of thing is the ultimate learning objective that you're trying to push across to students?
That is a really great question. So on the one hand, there's just a very shallow answer to that question, which
Right.
is, one core learning objective is the vocabulary. We want them to
Hmm.
have a sense of what the word means, to be just
Yep.
a more informed consumer of
Hmm.
information going forward when they leave the course. But also that labor market developments matter for so much of not
Hmm.
just the economy and not just for individuals experiencing the ups and downs, but government policy itself.
Hmm.
And I guess maybe that's because I have a deep interest in policy, and so try and work in examples like that all the time. But governments respond to labor
Hmm.
market data, and they respond quickly.
Hmm.
uh, that's their incentive to do that. And so, as an individual, when unemployment rates are going up and down, especially someone who later on in their life, they may be a leader in an organization who needs to think about the environment they're working in. Public policy and how it changes is a very important part of that. And so, if they can more intelligently think about how governments may respond to changes in labor market statistics, they can be better prepared to either take
Hmm.
advantage of opportunities or weather storms that come along.
No, I think yeah, just pick up on one of the things you mentioned. I think it's really important that everybody who's thinking about teaching this stuff understands that a first year course is partially a linguistic course, right?
That's a good way to phrase it. I talk
You,
about it
you,
as a survey course. We're going to do a lot, and we're
mm,
going to do a lot in a pretty shallow way, but that's okay. It's a first year. There's
yeah.
ample opportunity to dive deeper later on. And if they don't, my goal through all the first year courses, micro, macro, is to think about providing intuition to make
Hmm.
them just more informed individuals as consumers of news and developments that occur inevitably
Yeah,
as they.
absolutely. I had a colleague ask me this question, and it was an interesting discussion. But I'll ask you because you're the guest, and so I'll throw you under that bus. Um, do you explicitly get into Okun's law?
I no,
Okay,
I
no,
don't.
that's fine.
Yeah. So that connection between unemployment and GDP growth rates. I mean, this is something where it's pretty useful later, potentially
Hmm.
because I think some statistical knowledge might be very important in order to really properly think about, how do I understand a relationship between two variables? How do I
Right.
estimate this? What does it mean? What does it not mean? And that might be better later on after they've had maybe a stats course or two under their belt.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say though that you implicitly get into it, but you don't explicitly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly implicitly in the sense that there's a connection between
Hmm.
labor market, slack, and GDP as we talked about it. So PPF's a way to illustrate that and get a sense of what that is, certainly. But in terms of that actual, can you use one to predict changes in the other, and how do the magnitudes compare? I don't generally
Yeah.
go that far.
Yeah. That your answer actually lines up really nice with mine, so I feel better.
Okay.
Any tricks and gimmicks other you talked a lot about the data and the visualization. Any weird stunts you pull in the classroom to get this across, or
Yeah, I guess my style is not one that really succeeds in stunts. Often it
okay.
doesn't succeed with humor either. So what do I
Okay.
tend to do aside from just myself droning on or engaging
Hmm.
with student questions and slides? So I do actually use a lot of, first, podcasts.
Hmm.
Planet Money is something I
Okay.
turn to quite a bit. And so I'll have some of these assigned, and we'll play some clips from them and try and connect some of the insight
Nice.
we have in class to that. It's a nice break to play a brief clip for me to have some water and break things up. And then also YouTube videos and news clips,
Mm.
especially recently, where a lot of things can change pretty quickly. And when labor force information and when so much other macro information comes out
Hmm.
monthly, there's often
Yeah.
news stories that'll pop up, and you can play a couple of minutes there and then try and digest or reframe or rephrase what some of the reporter
Hmm.
commentary was during those clips. And hopefully, that can illustrate a way to translate news media, either in print or, in this case,
Right.
um, video, because the language that's used to sometimes describe the actual phenomenon we're studying in class is different than the language that we're using in the
Right.
economics context. And so
Making that link.
having it connected explicitly is hopefully a way to, I guess, better deliver that intuition or solidify the intuition that's already
Mm.
there.
It's always a good idea to model being a more attentive consumer of news. Anyway,
Yeah. Or
um,
I don't know if
go
this
ahead.
works or not. So I'll play sometimes movie clips, but
Mm.
increasingly movies are, for me, getting a little older. So I'm not, like, it's happening.
Yep. Oh yeah, it's
And
it's
I think,
it's
oh,
crazy.
maybe they haven't seen this one before. I
Yeah.
have a whole
Well,
story, like, for a couple of years trying to illustrate deadweight loss um, with, now I'm drawing a blank about what the movie is. Nicole Kidman, uh, Tom Cruise
not
movie
Eyes Wide
where,
Shut, is
no,
it? No. I'm like,
oh,
what? I don't.
drawing a blank.
I'm
No,
not
it's
getting
like
dead weight loss out of
where
that one.
it's they're in Oklahoma and they're lining up to race towards some of these unclaimed land plots, but everyone's just
Oh,
fallen over themselves.
the
Everything's getting,
Western one. Yeah.
yeah, everything's
Yeah.
getting damaged,
That was the
and
one
they're
where
all like,
was that the one where he was supposed to be Irish?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think he was,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. I know the movie.
And so that's a way to teach rent seeking and
Oh,
the
fun. Okay.
real resource losses involved in competing to.
Right. Right.
But I don't
Oh,
think
that's
anyone's
clever.
seen that movie
Oh, yeah,
before.
no, yeah, I did, I had to drag that one out of the archive. So how long are your classes? Like, how long is a typical
Oh,
class for you?
so here 50 minutes, and we'll do
Okay, so
that three
you're in that.
times a week.
Yeah, so you're in
So
that.
the
Just if you're
normal
using
one,
all this mixed media stuff, that can be a time drain.
oh, just a couple of minutes. So it won't be a
Hmm.
very long clip, but yeah, 2-3 minutes. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
guess I've never found it cut in too much.
Okay. No, let's.
The lecture, and
If it works for you, it works for you. It's a great idea. I just was trying to imagine managing the time. Um, so how do you evaluate? When it comes to evaluation, you've talked about some of your learning objectives and what you're hoping to get across. How do you find, like, what do you do not only just to give a grade, but to assess the deeper learning as well.
I definitely don't assess in what would be considered an ideal way from a
No, we can't.
pedagogical perspective. So the first year classes here, I've taught as large as 500.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And in that case, you're kind of constrained to
Mhm.
using machine graded approaches. I mean,
Yeah.
we as a department do have enough teaching assistants around to incorporate some written grading, but not
Oh,
enough for all sections to incorporate that.
oh,
Usually they'll
my.
just be an instructor, maybe sometimes two, that we load up with a lot of extra
Mhm.
graduate student support to facilitate the more grading intensive things they have
Right.
planned, and then the other sections rely on the machine graded approaches. And so it's not just
Mhm.
multiple choice, but fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Different publisher platforms have different
Mhm.
interactive graph drawing tools, and so
Mhm.
utilizing some of those as well. So it's basically just heavily relying on whatever the supplementary graded
Mm.
material is. And that can be a challenge at different
Mhm.
institutions because often that's something that students need to buy.
Yeah.
And so arranging for free access to that does require a little bit of negotiation with the textbook rep, but often they're willing to think about engaging on those. And so we have computers here in our main library that you can access these
Mhm.
platforms on for free. And then for certain specified times, we've had where like kind of special temporary access is provided.
Okay.
And so depending on what arrangements are possible, then
Mhm.
that can be useful to do. But just yeah, in general, it's exams, machine graded, midterms and finals, and then assignments throughout the semester, lots of them,
Mhm.
gone over by TAs during
Okay.
tutorial sessions. And so this provides a much
Some
smaller,
feedback.
maybe about 25 to 30 students
Oh,
to
nice.
really have a much more interactive experience going through some problems, showing how they would be solved step by step, and then having assignments that kind of track the end of chapter questions
Mhm.
as we progress through the
Right.
semester. And they're not worth very much. They're
No.
worth collectively they are, but each one very limited amounts. But it's something
Yeah.
that kind of keeps people on track as well. And I hope that that's altogether enough.
So the assignments are like, high frequency, low stake, kind of more check
Exactly.
in
Exactly.
or yeah,
Yeah,
self.
and not timed in any way. So there's a due
Mhm.
date, but people can log on, save,
Yeah.
consult with friends. So the distribution is very compressed
Yeah.
of those grades at the higher end. I think it's just fine. It's an incentive to keep things moving along.
Absolutely. So, I thanks. This has been great. I'll let you sort of end with some words of wisdom for uh, maybe a new instructor, and I'll ask you to some. This is something I've seen happen a few times. Is micro instructors or people with a micro background get tossed into these intro macro courses, sometimes kicking and screaming. Um, what advice would you give to either or both of those two groups?
So I think two sets of advice, maybe. So separate advice for first year classes. So for me, I think they play a very unique role in the set of classes that most economics departments teach. That
Mhm.
first year class is going to be something that at most universities, thousands of people are going to be going through from
Mhm.
all over campus. It almost doesn't matter what the program is. The likelihood of going through an intro econ class is extremely high.
Mhm.
And that means it's a chance to provide really solid intuition, right? Really try and instill the economics way of thinking, like economics
Mhm.
not as markets or investments and things like this, markets as a framework to evaluate decisions, right? And when you
Mhm.
frame it in this way, and when you try and make sure that the content is relevant for everyone, which requires an intuitive approach to teaching it, then it's something that adds value regardless of what someone's actual major
Mhm.
ends up being. But I also find that intuitive, accessible approach in these first year classes can increase the number of econ majors, right? It's a
Mhm.
marketing opportunity for the
Absolutely.
field, right? Pulls people in. They go, wow, this is interesting and exciting. And that does mean often not spending an entire, lecture going through how to solve two equations and two unknowns. That's
Yeah.
not the type of engaging content that'll pull people into this as a major. So I steer clear almost entirely of math.
Oh.
You can get away with a lot. And, tutorials can do that
Mhm.
for sure. You can have a couple of questions, and I do this, a couple of questions, really just to distinguish some of the really stellar students from others. But
Right.
the overwhelming majority of what I do is about economics as a way of thinking.
Mhm.
Um, and I hope that's effective marketing. That's certainly the goal. And at the very least, it's something that will add value to everyone in the class, regardless of where they go. And then I guess the second piece of advice, which would be for younger, maybe people freshly hired,
Mm.
haven't taught before, is to really focus on the students
Mm.
when you teach, and depending on one's comfort at the front of a classroom, there's certainly naturally some nerves there, especially early on in one's career, and the tendency is to have some notes and read off them, or use slides as a crutch,
Mhm.
that you're effectively just verbalizing what's literally on the slides, and that's not it's
No,
not very
it's not
engaging or
effective.
effective.
Yeah.
And so really do talk with the
Mhm.
students. Look some of them, even in these very large classes, right? Try and find the ones that are there and want to engage. The front rows are, there's a selection bias there. They're filled with people who
Yeah.
actually do want to engage. So open with questions, look people
Mhm.
in the eye, approach it in a conversational way.
Mhm.
Um, that both eases stress, I think, as an instructor, and improves the experience for the students as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. This has been talking about teaching economics. My guest today has been Trevor Tombe.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.